Thanks for having me back. I know some of you were in my good bug, bad bug talk a few weeks back. This is a lecture I put together about plant diseases, and it's not just how to identify them, but it's a lot of other good info too. We live where it rains a lot, it's hot, it's humid, and as one of the Ag Center's plant pathologists would say, where do you want to go on vacation? Probably somewhere warm, tropical, really lush. Well, that's exactly where plant pathogens want to be too. So unfortunately, that does include South Louisiana. I'm pretty sure everyone here, if they were to pop out into their garden or their lawn after this lecture and investigate after it, they will find some plant disease, and that's nothing to panic about. It's completely normal for any part of the world, but especially here for South Louisiana. A little bit of an outline of what we'll cover in this talk. Talk a little bit about why diseases develop in the first place, symptoms and signs of disease and how to tell them apart, a little bit of diagnostic logic. These are a set of questions that you guys can take with you to investigate in your gardens and kind of get to the bottom of plant disease, its causes, what it might be, identifying it. We'll talk a little bit about lookalikes, which could include insect damage. We covered a lot of that in the last lecture, but also some abiotic conditions, which mean non-biotic, so non-living conditions that can be nutrient stress, it can be heat stress that might present symptoms or signs that look a lot like plant disease, but in fact are not disease, they're environmental conditions. I have some of my top diseases from G&O area gardens, kind of my best of the best list, so you guys will be able to see those. I'll touch briefly on a disease management IPM toolbox, and this will be kind of a theme throughout the slideshow. What are some things, if we're observing disease that we can do to either, prevent the spread of it or manage it? The interesting thing about plants is once they're diseased, you can't cure them. It's not like a sick puppy or a sick human. In the plant world, there are no cures for disease. There's only prevention or management. So just kind of file that one away for later. And then I'll walk you guys through some of the resources that we have through the LSU Ag Center and how you can access those also. Okay, we'll start here. This is, I know some of my Master Gardener students are in this class now too. They probably recognize this. This is the disease triangle. Without all of these things, so pathogen, environmental conditions, or a susceptible host, you're not going to have the presence of disease. So if we're gardeners or farmers, and I'm willing to bet everyone in this talk has plants or a landscape or a garden or a crop growing of some kind, that would be your susceptible host. So what plants are you growing and what can infect them? Pathogens. There's a lot of different kinds of pathogens. We'll cover a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. But if the pathogens, say the bacteria, the virus, the nematode, if that's not in the environment where you are growing your crop or your plants, then you're not going to have that disease, right? So if you don't have the pathogen, there's no disease. And then lastly, environment. That's environmental conditions that are conducive to disease transmission. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. That becomes very important here in South Louisiana when it comes to preventing or managing a lot of diseases that we might encounter in our landscapes. So keep this disease triangle in the back of your mind that we have to have all three of these things for disease to occur. Okay, first off, let's talk a little bit about the host plant and why that's important. That's the crop or the plant that we are trying to cultivate. It's important that you know what these plants look like when they're healthy. On that slide there, I've got a picture of a variegated monstera. Now, if you'd never seen a variegated plant before, you might be inclined to think, oh, that's diseased or it has some sort of problem. But really, that's what it's supposed to look like. And it's very expensive and sought after for that kind of beautiful pattern of variegation. It's got holes in its leaves. You might panic over that too, but indeed, that's what that plant is supposed to look like. So familiarizing yourself with what your crops or your plants in the landscape your trees. What they're supposed to look like in a healthy state is a really good thing to start with. That could include a colorful leaf margin. Does it have an interesting texture? Odd colorations in certain times of year. That could be fall coloration or just some sort of cold response. Just kind of do a little research on the front end there with your host plants. Next, that second leg of the triangle, the pathogen. These are our disease-causing agents, and I have them listed here. We think about them in terms of human or animal science medicine as well. Many of them, they have specific hosts. So these are pathogens that host specifically on plants. They can include bacteria, fungus, phytoplasmas, which are little cells that lack a cell wall that are vectored by insects. And I have some really good examples of those coming up. Nematodes, which are tiny microscopic worms that are found pretty much everywhere outdoors. Parasitic algae, higher parasitic plants, so that could include things like mistletoe. Spiroplasmas, which are similar to the phytoplasmas. They're little cellular organisms shaped like a helix or a spiral, hence the name spiroplasma, that lack a cell wall also, so they like to get into other cells to survive. Viruses or viroids, water molds, and osteomycetes, very, very common in our wet conditions here. And I do want to make a note that I will talk about one thing in this lecture that's not a pathogen, and those are epiphytes. A good example of that would be lichen and maybe some orchids. If you think about where orchids grow, they use trees and branches and other structures as a platform to survive on, but they're not actually taking anything from their host. Other than a supportive environment. They're not exchanging nutrients or stealing anything from that host. So epiphytes are actually not pathogens. They're considered to be harmless. The third corner of that triangle is a conducive environment. You have to have the right conditions for a disease to occur. And in many cases, with a lot of the diseases that we find here in the New Orleans area, that means either hot, humid weather, wet weather, heat stress, specific temperature ranges. A lot of these pathogens are more active within certain temperature parameters. So if I know it's over 75 degrees, I know I'll see certain diseases. If it's below 45, we're more likely to see others. That's something that you can really dig into using some of the resources the Ag Center has. Frost damage, that can injure cell walls to the extent making them rupture, that becomes an entry point for other pathogens like bacteria or a fungus perhaps. The time of season is really important too. One thing I've learned, working as an extension agent in the New Orleans area is that things are very cyclical and they show up around the same time every year. So once you kind of get the pattern established, at least with the plants that you're growing, like, oh, I know black spot shows up around this time each year in my roses. You can actually take some corrective actions on the front end and prevent a big outbreak of disease in advance of the conducive timing or environment or the pathogen appearing in that environment. I would add a fourth element to this disease triangle, and that's time. You can have all three of these things in a room together, and it might take years, it might take hours, it might take weeks for that pathogen to infect the susceptible host if the environmental conditions are correct. Some of these things are very, very slow to reproduce, very, very slow to colonize things. Others are incredibly fast and super efficient once they get into a host in colonizing them and causing a disease. So it really does vary based on what the pathogen is, how conducive the environment is, what the host is, and also how much time it has to act. So symptoms versus signs. This is where we kind of put on our lab coat a little and we start talking about what are some of the things when we're out in the landscape, we're out in our gardens, out in the fields, what are some of the things that might tip us off that we're dealing with a plant disease versus say insect damage or something environmental that could be causing stress to these plants and causing them in a lot of cases to look sick, produce less, or die even. So signs versus symptoms. This is something to look for. If all the elements of the disease triangle are present, the disease will follow. Symptoms are visual clues that a disease has infected a plant. So if we're looking at this little sad tomato, what are some of the symptoms? Well, it's wilting. There might be some brown discoloration to the leaves. Signs are visible parts of the actual pest or pathogen. Like if this was a tomato infected by root knot nematodes, which we'll show you some pictures of later. If I were to pull that sad tomato plant up and look at the roots and I actually see the nematodes, that would be a sign, versus the symptom being the wilting and the browning of the leaves. So signs and symptoms are different, but they're also very related. Sign is the actual pathogen. You can see it with your eye or with a microscope. And the symptoms are what it's causing. What are some of the responses or things in the plant that make you think that that pathogen is present? Some abiotic and insect damage can also present as signs and symptoms. So if I were to look at the sad tomato again, well, maybe we're going through a drought and that didn't get watered because somebody went on vacation for 3 weeks. Or, maybe it's late November and our first frost of the year just rolled through. And it got a little cold damage overnight. So these things are environmental. They don't necessarily mean that there's a disease there, but they can kind of mimic disease symptoms or signs. And again, that last point, remember, plant diseases are never cured, only managed. Unfortunately, they're not like a sick puppy. We can't just take them to the vet and cure them. They can only be managed. There are no cures out there in plant kingdom diseases. So let's start walking through some of these symptoms. As I get through these slides, I do have the diseases labeled, and you guys might want to make notes if you've seen these things on your plants. So you can look them up later. So if you see something you recognize, do a quick Google search after this lecture and you can come up with tons of information out there. It's not just LSU that puts out information and articles on these things. It's all the research at land-grant universities. It's the USDA. It's a lot of nonprofits. There's good info out there. So the first symptom that we're going to cover is blight. This is something that occurs on young growing tissues. It can be on the leaves, the branches, or the fruiting spurs. So if you had fruit trees, that would be where those fruit blossoms emerge. And it can impact fruits and leaves. I've got a couple of really common ones that I see in that blight category here, where if you look in the upper left, late blight on tomatoes. If you still have tomatoes lingering in your garden this late, chances are pretty good you're going to see this, where you see those brown blotches all over, and it's almost like a soft rotting of the fruit rind, in this case, the tomato skin. That's a blight. Down below, right immediately below it, we see early blight on tomatoes, another extremely common disease in our area. And here we see the blight is taking the form of concentric rings of necrotic tissue. So necrotic means dead, right? Those brown rings are dead plant cells and dead sections of the leaves. And then they're surrounded by kind of a yellow area. That's where the infection is spreading. And that's actually a watery tissue. The leaf is sort of turning a little chlorotic. And here's another term here. Chlorotic means it's starting to lose coloration and pigment. So it's turning pale around that infected area. So this is how blight would present as a symptom. And these are a couple of really easy to identify ones on tomatoes. I'll cover more on them a little later. But then if you're growing fruit trees, especially things that typically grow in more, I would say, up north areas, you might encounter fire blight. That's another really common blight in our area. I see it on persimmon. If you have peaches or pears in your yard, where the blight is actually on the stems and the twigs of the tree, and they're kind of like a sunken area on that bark, and it turns a little bit darker or lighter, but it's kind of sunk in. So blights can present on just about any part of the plant. Next up is blotch. Do not be confused. This is not the same as blight. Blotching are enlarged spots that are irregular in size and shape. They kind of blend into one another as well sometimes, where you see how they're kind of jumping over the leaf veins That's a good tip off. We're dealing with a blotch or leaf blotch pathogen. Whereas with the blight, and I'll go back, if you look down below at that early blight on the tomato, you see how the disease isn't really jumping those veins as much. The veins are kind of containing it to little sections of the leaf. That's kind of one of my visual clues that I'm dealing with a blight versus a blotch. And a lot of blotches are caused by bacteria. This is pretty common in our area, especially as we hit hot, humid weather, lots of rain every day. So we start to see it a lot. This is a mulberry leaf. And I'm willing to bet if anyone's got a mulberry anywhere near their house tonight, go out and look for this, you'll find it. This is a bacterial leaf spot. It's pretty harmless. It just causes some defoliation, typically of trees, broadleaf plants, and these things fall off, and that's kind of the end of the story. They're either replaced or it's very late in the year, so they're not replaced. Next up is canker. This is our next symptom to look at. These are areas of dead tissue on branches, trunks, or herbaceous stems, and they present or can present as corky, woody lesions on leaves or fruit surfaces, raised or atrophied tissue, and then some cankers may weep or ooze, and we'll talk a little bit more about this really disgusting looking ooze going on with this bacterial canker in a cherry tree in this case. But this is a canker where you can see it's kind of knotted and gnarled and raised up on this cherry where the bark has become damaged by that bacteria. And on the photo below, that's another bacterial infection on citrus. It's super common in our area called citrus canker. And you see how it's kind of raised up on that fruit and it's real corky and woody. Those are cankers. And sometimes they weep a really disgusting, almost pus-like bacterial ooze that might mix with sap as well. So that's how you know you might be dealing with a canker, typically caused by bacteria. Here's that C word again, chlorosis. This is another symptom of plant disease. It can also be a look-alike. So you have to be a little careful when you observe chlorosis in your plants. And again, chlorosis is where the plants are kind of bleaching out or losing their normal pigmentation, turning maybe a lighter shade of green, or in this case, white in the upper top photograph. So it's the loss of the normal color in the plant. So again, that's why it's really important to know what a healthy plant of whatever you're trying to grow looks like, so you know what the normal coloration is. And it generally refers to a yellowing or a paleness that occurs in the leaves. This can be caused by diseases, but it can also be caused by abiotic stress. So like that drought we had back in June, you could see some of this going on in certain plants. It's often caused in our area by nutrient imbalances in the soil or pH issues. And a really classic example is a gardenia. There's one down at the bottom photo. If it's in a soil with a pH that's too high, gardenias really enjoy a low pH soil. So if the pH is too high, it's unable to take up iron and it ends up chlorotic. So that's an abiotic problem versus a disease. This is not a diseased plant. This is something that can be fixed through proper fertilization. Herbicide damage is unfortunately becoming very common as a symptom in plants of damage. And up in this upper part, that's herbicide damaged tomato. I've seen a lot of fruit trees with herbicide damage recently this year too, usually caused by drift. If the neighbors are having their lawn treated or sprayed with any kind of herbicide and it's a little windy, or maybe these plants are growing on the opposite side of the fence, this kind of injury can occur. So when I get calls about it, folks might jump to the conclusion that this is a plant disease caused by a pathogen, so like maybe a virus, when in fact it is herbicide damage too. And that's where we have to kind of go put our Sherlock Holmes hat and get our microscope or our magnifying glass out and ask some questions to kind of deduct what this might be caused by. But chlorosis can be a disease symptom, but it can also be an abiotic symptom as well, or something else is going on. Next up is dampening off. This is when young plants are killed shortly after they emerge from the seeds. And these pathogens attack plants right at the soil line. So if you look at these seedlings, they look like they might have been cucumbers or something in the cucurbit family. You see how up at the top of the seedlings, those stems are nice and plump. They look round and strong. And then once you get down to the soil line, they turn into like brown, stringy, a stringy mess. That's because the pathogen is impacting that plant tissue right at the soil line. It's often called seedling disease, and this we'll talk about a little bit later too. Where dampening off occurs, it means that conditions are usually too cold, too moist for those seedlings to get through and overcome that pathogen. So we end up with dampening off. Super common if you try to start seeds from scratch yourself. Dieback is another symptom of disease. This is where twigs or whole branches will die back, often to a branch union, sometimes to the soil line. It can look a little similar to blight in some cases, but really what it is where sections of the canopy die out. And this is a pretty good example that I see all over New Orleans. This is boxwood dieback disease. And you can see where like sections of those boxwoods are starting to die out, but then they're right next to green sections. It usually corresponds to death in the root zone immediately underneath where that dieback is occurring, or maybe there's some sort of infection within the vascular tissue within the stems of that plant that block it from getting the nutrients and the water it needs from the root zone. So then we end up with these dead sections. And I guarantee this is one disease you guys will get out there in the next few days and you'll start noticing all over New Orleans, dieback, boxwood dieback. So that's a symptom. Galls are another symptom of plant pathogens. And in this case, it's often a nematode or maybe a parasitic wasp, some other kind of insect, where it's actually getting damaged by that thing. And then the plants are stimulating abnormal cell growth and kind of encasing that pathogen. A really good example of that is oak galls. If anyone's ever thought these were fruits that fell out of a tree or seen them up in the oaks especially, this is caused by a little parasitic wasp that actually lives inside that plant, and then the plant creates this little protective gall around it. And then they complete their life cycle within that gall. It's kind of a mutualistic relationship. It is a disease, but it's a harmless thing, a harmless condition. A little less harmless is the okra root knot nematode. And this is something that I see a lot in the area. There are other kinds of root knot nematodes that impact guava and sweet potatoes. There's a bunch of them, but this is a really common one I see in New Orleans, especially, where we have two okra plants pulled up out of the ground there. The one on the right is a healthy okra root system. The one on the left looks kind of like Mardi Gras beads, or maybe something that is not very healthy, right? Those are galls that have formed around where the nematodes are feeding and living in the root system. So that's why that's called a gall. They're actually in there, and it's a symptom of the pathogen, which in this case would be the root knot nematode. Another gall that I see occasionally in the area, it's really more of a problem up north, is the cedar apple rust pathogen. And it creates a gall, and it has two hosts, so cedar and apple. You need both to have this pathogen show up. But when it's in the actual cedar part of its life cycle, it forms this very, very weird alien looking gall. So galls are a symptom of a pathogen activity. Gummosis. This is where sap or resin oozes out of the plant. I see it an awful lot in immature peaches or peach trees in the area. Peaches are really difficult to grow here because of issues related that actually manifest with a little gummosis. Fruits form gummosis when cankers are present. So remember that bacterial canker we looked at in a few slides back. It's actually making this ooze. It's mixing with the sap, and that's kind of gummy and sticky, and that's gummosis. It can occur with stem blight. That's that upper right-hand picture where that stem has been damaged by the blight pathogen, and now it's oozing that bacterial ooze and a little resin or maybe sap to cause the gummosis. It can be secondary following injury though. So in the case of that immature peach fruit that somebody's holding up, that was actually insect damage that then a secondary condition of that damage is the gummosis. We can see this in some trees too. If the trees are hit by a car, for example, and it gets infected with bacteria, then it might cause some gummosis, where you get that secondary infection within the wound before the tree can heal and seal the damage off. So that's one to keep an eye out for. It often can have an odor associated to it too, a kind of unpleasant odor. And usually there's no treatment for this. Sometimes in the case of trees, they're able to compartmentalize and seal off some of that damage. So it's kind of a waiting game, wait and see. Another symptom would be leaf curl and blister of the leaf. This is where the cells enlarge on one side of the leaf more rapidly than the other, so it kind of curls over on itself, or the leaves are kind of cupped as a stress response. Viruses can cause this. Tomato leaf curl virus is something that you'll read about when you're shopping for tomato varieties and seed catalogs, because they have been bred certain varieties for resistance to that virus. However, fungus can also cause it. Heat stress can cause it. There's a tomato yellow leaf curl virus, really good picture of it there, where it kind of has a chlorotic look to it, and then those leaves curl in on one another. But herbicide damage can also present as leaf curl too. And unfortunately, dicamba is sometimes used in lawns or on properties. And if it drifts, especially towards tomatoes or roses, both are very incredibly sensitive to it. It can actually cause this cupping, blistering of the leaves, or curling of the leaves too. So this is another one where if you encounter this symptom, especially in tomatoes, you have to do a little detective work to see if there might be something else at foot. Not just a virus possibly, but maybe a herbicide damage or a fungus or some other kind of stressor causing the leaf curl and blister. Mosaic is another symptom. This is patterns of light and dark coloration. They often are associated with a viral infection. In that top picture, we see cucumber mosaic virus. There are also tobacco mosaic viruses, tomato mosaic viruses. They can be transmitted, in some cases, at least with the tobacco mosaic virus, through infected tobacco smoke. So if you're smoking the cigarette near these plants, they can pick up the virus from that. It can be transmitted in seed. That's why we buy inspected seed a lot, where we know it's been tested for the presence of viruses, so we're not bringing this into our gardens. With mosaic symptoms, it's important to know the normal coloration again of your healthy plants. And a really common one that I get calls about is from certain kinds of zucchini, typically showing up with this sort of mosaic pattern in the leaves where the leaf veins or the veinated areas are a little lighter or white, kind of gray color to them. That's just the normal coloration for zucchini. So that's nothing to be concerned about. That's a nice big healthy leaf there down in the bottom. But if I were growing zucchini and it started showing up with this sort of mottling or mosaic coloration, and I know it's not a cultivar that typically makes that normal coloration shown below, then I might investigate. Rot is our next symptom. Rotting is the chemical degradation of living cells. It is associated in plants with fruit rot, tuber rot, root rot, and other storage organs that can get infected. Usually it makes a wet, slimy material where the cells are starting to break down. It's extremely common in our area with many, many diseases. And some of them, certain bacterial rots will have an odor, a very bad odor associated with them as well. I pulled up two of my favorites here. The picture on the bottom is Phytophthora, which is a fungal pathogen, and it's causing buckeye rot on these tomatoes. You see how these tomatoes are rotting from the bottom. There's kind of concentric circles of infection. It's kind of sunken, but it's different than blossom end rot presenting, because of that end rot, you get almost like a callus at the bottom of the tomato, and that's caused by stress. The tomatoes are unable to take up enough calcium as those fruits are forming. With this buckeye rot, you don't get any callousing. If you go to pick that, your finger's going right through it. It's going to be oozy and gross. It's going to be squishy, not very pleasant. So that's how we know we're dealing with buckeye rot. That same pathogen, Phytophthora, loves to get into root systems of trees and shrubs, especially woody ornamentals, and sometimes some of our longer lived woodier vegetable crops like peppers that have been overwintered for multiple years. It actually is a zoospore that swims through soil moisture, which, what do we have in South Louisiana? We have soil moisture. And then the pathogen gets into the roots or splashes up onto the plants with the rain in the case of this buckeye rot, and infects the healthy cells and causes them to rot and die. You can see with the root rot up above, you can just tell visually looking at these symptoms that that's not a healthy root system. A healthy root system should have many strands of healthy root hairs. They should be plump, kind of grayish white in coloration, or maybe a light brown. Here we see a lot of dark, stringy looking roots where there's not a lot of root hairs present. So we know there's some sort of root rot at work here. Next up is scab. These are kind of like cankers, but the lesions are very rough in texture, almost like scabs that you'd get if you skinned your knees. There's irregular edges to them. They tend not to be circular, like we see in a lot of blights or cankers. Flaky texture. There's no watery ring or yellow ring around this infected material, which is how a lot of cankers will show up and present. But these are two really common scabs that we encounter. Sweet orange scab up at the top, really common in hot, humid weather, are trees that maybe don't get a lot of good airflow. And then down below is potato scab, where that was maybe grown in kind of a wet area, or maybe left in the ground a little too long and it got infected. Next up is scorch. This can be a disease symptom, but more often than not in our area, it's not. And scorch is defined as large, irregular, bleached or browned out areas, usually on a leaf margin, caused by rapid desiccation. So that's drying out of that plant tissue by heat, sun, drought, chemicals, including fertilizer if we over apply it, or pathogens. Two of the more common scorch symptoms that show up in New Orleans are this pepper scorch. It can also happen to tomatoes and eggplants, where if you pick your vegetables and they look like this, it's almost like a leathery section of that, in this case, bell pepper. It's a little bit sunken. That's caused by sunburn. It's actually not a disease. It's just, it wasn't shaded enough by the leaf canopy of the pepper plant, and it got sunburned from sun exposure. The other one I see an awful lot in our area is Japanese maples getting this sun scorch. Japanese maples are a true understory tree. Even the ones, if you go to the garden center and it says full sun on the tag, that means full sun in Kentucky, not South Louisiana. So oftentimes, especially in the summer, we get calls from people who planted these over the dormant season, and their Japanese maples look terrible, and it's from sunburn. They really do appreciate dappled shade or even full shade. Even the more sun tolerant or allegedly sun loving Japanese maples here in this far south, they really do need that shade condition. So both these scorches are not actually diseases, but these are our most common scorches in the area, and they're abiotic in nature versus pathogenic. Next symptom is shot hole. This is called shot hole for obvious reasons. It looks like it was shot with buckshot. The tissue from the leaf falls out, leaving these holes behind. This can also look a whole lot like snail and slug damage, Japanese or June bug beetle feeding damage. The key is to look at the edges of these shot holes. Sometimes you get that kind of watery yellow ring around it. That means we might have something more pathogenic versus a pest to deal with. This is something where having a handheld lens or a magnifying glass can really help you. And also just observing your plants. A lot of pests that cause this sort of leaf damage tend to feed typically at night. So take a walk out there, take a look under the leaves with your flashlight or headlamp and see who you can see. But shot hole can be a symptom of bacterial leaf spot, especially where those infected areas of the leaf kind of rot away. If we get a lot of rain, it causes this shot hole pattern. Spot seems like a very obvious one, but spotting of the leaves is a symptom of many plant diseases in our area. It's probably our more common symptom, and it can occur on the leaves, the stems, and the fruits. It can result from a single cell getting infected by a spore of fungus, a bacterial cell, or some other pathogen, and several spots may spread into one another to form blotches. Remember, blotch was one of our symptoms also. I pulled up some of our more common leaf spot diseases here. Cercospora or Cercospora is actually one of my band names back in the day. Leaf spot is really, really common on beets and chard, especially. If anyone's growing beets and chard every winter in their garden, you're going to see this pop up. That's Cercospora leaf spot. And you see it's got kind of a purple ring around these little lesions. Down below, this is showing up now. Cercospora leaf spot on crepe myrtles. This might be our only fall color we get other than Chinese tallow trees. I think it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite plant diseases. But this spotting is caused by the bacterial pathogen. These leaves become stressed. Obviously, they're not able to photosynthesize very effectively. So in this case with the crepe myrtles, they'll actually shed those leaves, and you'll find them all over the ground. Bacterial leaf spot on the monstera there at the right. That is not a healthy monstera. So we've got some blotching forming from the leaf spots kind of joining together, making larger areas of infection. So spots are something to keep an eye out for. Stunt is another good symptom. It can be caused by poor fertility in the soil, drought like we had back in June, compacted soil that can be something, like maybe there's a house on the site you're trying to plant into the ground. It doesn't drain so well. There's no air pores in the soil structure. Herbicide damage can also cause stunting in young plants. Nematodes and viruses can also cause stunted growth. So if you encounter stunted plants or you plant transplants out into your garden and they're just not taking off like they should, it's either abiotic, which is poor fertility, drought, compacted soil, herbicide damage, but it might also be biotic, which could indicate you have an issue with root rot nematodes, maybe a virus of some kind that caused stunted growth. But more often than not in our area, it's compacted soils. So down at the bottom, we've got some look like wax beans being grown in compacted soils there on the left. Compare that to the healthy plant on the right. It's got a much more extensive, far-ranging root system, so it can really support more bean production and probably a much larger plant overall. Versus when those roots are very restricted in that soil profile, they're not able to support as much production. The plants are very stunted. The other symptom where stunt pops up usually points to herbicide exposure. And I see this a lot in vegetable gardens or farms that grow vegetables where they're using a lot of compost as a soil input. Don't get me wrong, compost is fabulous. We should all be using lots and lots of compost. But if your compost was made from horse or carriage mule manure, or even cow or goat manure, where those animals are either being fed hay or pasturing on grass that has been treated with an herbicide called Grazon. That herbicide is really good at preventing broadleaf growth in pastures and hay fields, so it kills all the weeds. But when the animals eat that treated grass and then poop it out on the tail end of things, that Grazon is still there and it persists for 18 months, even after composting. And that causes significant damage to broadleaf plants. So like this eggplant here, it makes them stunted, it can kill them. So if your garden is just not taking off like it should, and you're planting a lot of transplants into compost or horse manure that you maybe let sit and age, chances are pretty good you've got a Grazon issue. It takes up to 2 years to break down fully in our gardens, and it's become a huge issue in our area. So if you're using manure, if you're using compost from things that eat grass, make sure you ask if that animal has been exposed to graze on via hay or treated pasture. And people might not know. I've called up a few of the stables in the area and talked with their owners, and they didn't know. So it's best to avoid those materials unless you know what that animal was eating. Wilt is another great symptom to look for. This is where plants can no longer take up adequate water to stay turgid. That's another good vocab word. Turgid means all the cells are full of water, they're nice and plump, and those leaves and branches are standing up straight and out versus wilting. So this usually indicates root or crown damage, where the vascular tissue has been damaged or the feeder roots have been damaged in some way. It means that that canopy, those leaves, can't take up enough water nutrients from the soil zone to stay healthy. So they end up losing water turgidity first as they respire and lose water through their leaves. And then you got the bigger issue. You got to look at the root zone to see what's going on. Most wilt, if I walk out into a field and see something like this, I know the plant's getting plenty of water. It's maybe getting irrigated. That's when I'm going to pull it up and take a look at what's going on under the ground. They're caused by fungal pathogens in many, many cases, but they can also be caused by nematodes or certain bacteria. But I would say 9.5 out of 10 of the time that I pull a plant up that looks like this with wilt, it's going to be some sort of fungal pathogen. So that pepper plant up top, I would definitely yank that out and take a look. Down below, you can see this is a tomato plant that was wilting that I yanked out. And this is Fusarium wilt. There's no feeder roots, right? So it's just those main roots and everything else has been rotten or eaten away. And if you were to slice open that stem, you would see the fungus inside in many cases. So if you have wilt and you've got plenty of water, or in some cases here, you know it's not getting too much water and it's still wilting, pull it out, take a look. You've probably got a fungus. The next symptom is witch's broom. This is one of my favorites. This is where the plant kind of goes crazy and makes large numbers of accessory shoots. It can be clusters of leaves, clusters of sticks or twigs. It can be viral or a natural mutation. For example, a nice viral one up at the top there is rose rosette disease. We don't have this in New Orleans. It's a virus that's spread by thrips and mites. It's up in the Shreveport area and all through Texas. So it's only a matter of time probably, but you see what that rose is doing after infection. It's created a witch's broom. So there's like a million little shoots where you might get 1 or 2 or 3 in a normal non-infected rose plant. And they're all kind of clustered together. The leaves are kind of twisted in on each other. And it's just a super dense mass of plant material. It can also be a trauma response. Where they'll form these witch's brooms. I see it in trees sometimes. For example, this is a witch's broom in a lemon tree. It's a variegated lemon, and it was exposed to 2,4-D, which is an herbicide, and it got so stressed it started creating these witch's brooms. So the leaves got really elongated. There's probably 40, 45 stems where you might have 2. So it can form in response to a trauma, but it can also be a viral indicator as well. Bacterial ooze. This is where the cells rupture and bacteria actually leaks out. So now we're switching from symptoms of pathogens into signs of pathogens. And if you remember from my first slides, signs are the actual pathogens that you can see. So this white ooze coming out of this melon, that's the actual bacteria that's causing that rot. So you can actually see it, and that's a sign. We have bacteria. It can resemble pus. It may ooze out with the plant sap also, but the bacterial ooze means, yep, we do have a pathogen, 100%, it's there. Another sign is cysts. This is where, with the nematodes, remember, which are small microscopic worms that inhabit every soil, everywhere. They're everywhere. I love them. Some are good, some are benign, some are bad, some are predatory, others are parasites. In the case of parasitic nematodes, they can cause these cysts on the plant root system. This is actually the female nematode. She's mature, she's ballooned up, and she is full of eggs. And you can pop those and all these little eggs will come out, and it's really gross. You can find these on freshly dug plant roots that are infected with nematodes, where those nematodes are happy, they're damaging the plant, but they're also reproducing. This is the potato nematode here, and you can pop that open. Same with the okra or the tomato root knot nematodes. You'll actually see the cysts with a hand lens or a microscope, and you can actually pop them open and take a look inside, and it's full of eggs. So that's a sign, right? That's the actual pathogen right there. Next up is mycelium. This is, we say the vegetative part of the fungus because the actual mushroom is like the flower of the fungus. Mycelium, think of it as the root system of the fungus. They are single strands called hyphae, kind of grow together in a mat. Those hyphae actually enter the root hairs or pierce into plant cells. That can be a good thing if it's a beneficial fungus or beneficial mycelium. I know biocontrols, biostimulants are all really popular in gardening right now, where we might inoculate our gardens with beneficial mycelium because those hyphae can actually transmit and exchange nutrients and water with plant roots. And it's a mutualistic exchange. So they're actually benefiting one another. They can also be pathogens and cause disease. So here we've got a couple of common ones in our area, both of them blights. The southern blight of tomato, you see that mycelium down at the base of these infected tomato plants. And same thing down there at the bottom with southern blight in your tomato. If your tomato is wilting, it's not really ripening its fruit very quickly, it's got lots of brown leaves, take a look right above the soil line. You might pick up on some of this mycelium action, and that indicates one of these blights, and you should pull it out. Fruiting bodies, this goes hand in hand with the mycelium, right? These are the reproductive organs of fungal pathogens. They can be mushrooms or conchs, which grow on trees often. They're like woody little knobs. They indicate an infested root or vascular system. So if you see these on your trees, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, mostly they're bad. I've got two of the really common ones pictured here. Up top, that's Armillaria root rot. I know that tree is doomed because I see these guys kind of circling the trunk. They show up in fall once things start to cool off. But the foraging person in me who likes to go out and pick edible mushrooms is going to be like, oh yeah, ringless honey mushrooms. Those have great flavor. I'm going to cook those up tonight. So though it is killing that tree slowly, I can harvest those mushrooms and cook them up later. Another good example of that, Ganoderma heart rot. And this is an infected citrus tree. If we have any herbalists in the room, they're going to recognize that as reishi, which is a medicinal mushroom used in a lot of traditional medicines and therapies. That indicates that that tree is doomed. It's got an infested root, and in the case of this one, heart of the tree as well. Once we see this, there's no cure, only management, but you're just kind of prolonging death at that point. I've seen citrus trees with these big Ganodermas on them that had maybe a dozen successful years since they told me it first showed up. It is really a slow death. So you might get some good years out of that tree in the meantime. If I do see this maybe in a shade tree next to my house or my garage and it's hurricane season, I might want to have somebody come take a look at it and do a structural assessment because that tree might be hollowed out or the root zone compromised where it's going to blow over really easy in a storm. And nobody wants that. So if you see these signs, it might indicate a root rot pathogen or heart rot pathogen. Molds are another good sign of plant disease. They occur where mycelium and spore structures are found, and they can occur on the plants or the fruits. Some are useful. Two of the really common ones in our area, if you've ever tried to grow strawberries, pretty good chance you've seen this gray mold on your strawberries. It's called botrytis, and you can see where that mold is actually kind of fuzzy and causing kind of a watery, sunken, rotted section of that strawberry. That's a mold. Another one I see an awful lot on citrus rinds is penicillin. Hey, we know what that is. That's an antibiotic. That's useful. Some of them are very useful. So we see penicillin show up. It's kind of a blue-gray mold that shows up on citrus rinds. It can cause soft rot of that fruit once it gets past that rind. Mildews. This is another really good sign of disease. If anyone's tried to grow any kind of cucurbit, so pumpkins, squash, mirlitons, loofahs, anything like that, chances are pretty good you've seen both downy mildew and powdery mildew. This is a pathogen that grows on leaf or stem surfaces. It often has a fuzzy appearance if you look at it up close. I see both downy and powdery mildew all over. And sometimes you see them on the same leaf, like this one. The downy mildew, you can see on the top of the leaf, you got some chlorosis. You flip that over, you're gonna see the little fruiting bodies or the fuzzy appearance on the bottom. With the powdery mildew, you see that fuzzy appearance on the top side of the leaf. There might be a little on the underside, but that's how you tell them apart. In kind of a very simplistic way. You can use a hand lens or a microscope to take a look at them, but if you're gonna see that blotchiness on the top and they're fuzzy down below on the bottom of the leaf, you probably got downy mildew. If you got it on the top where it's a little fuzzy, that's the powdery. Rust is another sign. They're orange or red pustules that form usually on the leaves. Most are very host specific. So if you're growing a fig tree and it looks terrible this time of year, don't worry, it's not going to make everything else in your yard look terrible. Many have an alternating spore and multiple host, like we talked about that cedar apple rust. But in our area, the two very common rusts that I see or get calls about, fig rust. That's up top there. You see that spotting of the leaves. If you were to look at it under a hand lens, you would actually see the rust on the leaf surface. And then blackberry rust down below, where it's kind of this bright orange color, usually on the underside of the leaves. Both are spread through wind and rain and humidity. What do we have this time of year? Wind, rain, and humidity. In the case of the fig rust, that rust will actually cause a lot of those infected leaves to drop off. Don't worry about it. Just rake them up, bag them, and trash them. Don't compost them. You'll just spread the rust. But they'll actually sprout out, leaf out again before they actually go dormant for the winter, if they go dormant. So that's a harmless one. We don't actually even treat for. The blackberry rust down at the bottom, though, once your blackberry plants are infected with that, it's best to pull them and burn them or double bag them and trash them because there's no cure and they will eventually die from that rust. And again, remember, plants are not puppies. You can't take them to the vet to get cured. There's only management. So in the case of the fig rust, the management action would be maybe rake the leaves up so it doesn't spread too far into the figs, but it's not going to hurt the yield. It's not going to hurt the plant's health any. But in the case of the blackberry, yeah, it's going to hurt the plant. It's not going to be productive, and it's going to infect any other blackberries that might try to grow nearby. So it's best to get rid of it. Sclerotium, there's a vocab word for you. Fungal mycelium that become hardened into a seed-like fruiting body. So think of it like a mushroom that is kind of hardened and round. These things are full of spores, can actually reinfect plants. They persist in the soil for, in some cases, decades, many decades. They can be less than 1 millimeter big to the size of a baseball. And here there's a couple of really good examples. Southern blight is one that can persist in our soils for 30, 40 years. And you pull the plant and all these little bodies fall off into the soil. It's impossible to pick them all out. And it's just waiting for proper environmental conditions and a new host plant to reinfect. Same thing with that potato stem rot there down at the bottom. Once that gets into a field, very, very difficult to manage because they can lie dormant in the soil for decades. So you usually have to plant something else. Smut is a really great symptom or sign, very similar to a rust, same division of fungus. where spores are produced within the host plant. It's usually systemic, so the whole corn or the whole wheat is infected. Corn smut is actually a delicacy. You can eat that. It's kind of an interesting texture and flavor, but it is a plant disease. Same thing with wheat smut down there below. So we made it through our signs and symptoms. I'm going to take you guys through this little key, and any of my master gardeners in here, this is actually in your plant pathology chapter in your master gardener manual. And I kind of abridged it a little for this slide. But if I am in my garden, in my landscape, if I'm called out to somebody's farm or somebody's home to diagnose a disease, these are some of the questions that I kind of Sherlock Holmes my way through, and can usually figure out what's going on, or at least narrow it down if I'm seeing signs or symptoms that might indicate disease in plants. So first off, we already talked about this. What is the plant? Be able to identify the plant. If you don't know what it is, take a picture of it. The apps have gotten pretty good at IDing plants. If possible, know the variety of it. This is important, especially in some cucurbits or tomatoes. Like, is it a resistant variety? Is it not? Is it maybe more susceptible? Be able to rule out issues with growing zone, timing, or cultural requirements. So that's really important. If I'm trying to grow collard greens and it's July in New Orleans and they have lots of bacterial leaf spot, well, I know that's an issue with timing, right? That's really more of a cold crop. It likes the cool season, and it probably isn't going to do great in July. Cultural requirements, so like that gardenia where it was real chlorotic, is it planted in an area with a high pH soil? Well, okay, so maybe its cultural requirements were not met, so there might not be a disease in that case. How old is the plant? That's really important because, contrary to popular belief, plants are not immortal. Even trees, even shrubs, even your grandma's rose bush that's been in the family 60, 70 years, they're not immortal. They will die someday, I promise. They all do. Some of them live thousands of years, like the sequoias and the redwoods, but all plants have a end point. So knowing the age of the plant and the typical lifespan of the plant, very important. What are the symptoms and signs? Well, you guys should be whizzes at that now because we just went through them. That includes your wilting, your spotting, cankers, any ooze. So take a look at the signs and symptoms. Here's an important one. How does the surrounding vegetation look? Is it just that plant, or is it maybe the row of tomatoes and everything else looks fine? How does it look around that area? That's going to give you some clues. When did the symptoms form? Did it happen overnight? Did it start to slowly decline? Has it happened before? Maybe you pulled out a sick or a dead plant and put a new one in the same spot. That's that element of time, very, very important. But that can also be a diagnostic tool where if you pulled out all your boxwoods because they died, you came back in and you planted new boxwoods and oh no, they're dying now too. That's usually a pretty good indication there's a disease present. Distribution. Is the disease showing up in a single area or is it spreading to multiple plants? So in the case of that row of boxwoods, maybe in the hedge, did you have one dead one and then all of a sudden the two on either side died and then, oh my gosh, the whole thing died. That's a really important clue. Different diseases move through populations differently. So you can identify them or diagnose them sometimes using that. Association of symptoms and signs with the terrain, soil conditions, or drainage. Certain diseases or conditions in plants are more prevalent when other environmental conditions are there. So this time of year, if I see a lot of canopy dieback and dead trees and the soil is really waterlogged, I might start looking for a root rot pathogen that likes waterlogged soil. Is there a lot of maybe humidity and it's been real cold out? That might be a really good environment for certain pathogens. Terrain is important. That soil compaction element could be something abiotic, right? So make a note of that. How much rainfall has recently happened? What's the ambient humidity recently? Has there been a drought? Was there maybe some hail damage or frost damage? all really important to note. Could the plant have been injured by pets, herbicides, equipment? Was it hit by an Amazon truck? I saw that on Monday. Really important to know, is that plant injured in some way where you might have some secondary infection, maybe a bacteria or a fungus gets into that wound, or because it's stressed, it's more susceptible to that pathogen. That can help us diagnose things also. This one, super important, especially with woody things like trees and shrubs. Was it planted too deeply? Each plant has a preferred root zone and a preferred stem or trunk, and they don't like when their stems or trunks are buried, most of them. Exceptions being like tomatoes, which like to be planted deeply. They root all along that stem. But in the case of trees, especially, if they're planted much too deeply, that can invite a lot of rot coming into that tissue that's not supposed to make contact with the soil, and it can open it up to a lot of pathogens. Was the plant pot bound when you planted it? So were there circulating roots or ties that maybe weren't removed? If it were tied to a stake or something like that, and then it grew and that tie or that chain or that wire cut into the plant, that can indicate conditions where disease might take advantage of that. Are there insects present? That's real important. Disease can follow insect damage. Good example of that is the citrus leaf miner, which eats on the leaves of citrus, makes kind of a silver trail, sorry. It makes a silver trail and a bacterial canker comes in behind it. So presence of insects can also point you towards, maybe this is just insect damage, I need to use an insecticide or some management plan for insects. Or is this an opportunity for a disease to come in also? Is there a pattern to the damage or is it evenly spaced? What percentage of the leaves or plant is impacted? In the case of fig rust, it can be almost 100% damage, and I know that tree is going to be fine. But in the case of blackberry rust, if it's one leaf, I know that entire plant is doomed. So that can be a really good, important diagnostic tool. Where on the plant is the damage occurring? Are the plants malnourished or might there be a pH issue? That's why it's really nice to do a soil test periodically. Did the plant fail to bloom or fruit in its season? Often when plants are diseases or stressed, they'll flower out of season. I saw that a lot after both hurricanes. Or they'll form fruit out of season as kind of like a last ditch effort to get their genes out there and save themselves. That can point towards disease. Has there been a gas leak or a fire in the area? Seen that a couple of times too, where plants may present symptoms of disease, but it's actually a stress response or they got burned or singed by fire. So these are some really good questions to ask when you're trying to get to the bottom of, do I have a disease? How do I manage it? Or is there maybe something else going on? So to dig into some of those, insect damage. It's a really good idea to scout plants that are getting damaged early in the evening or early in the morning for pest activity. A lot of these things feed nocturnally. It's a little safer for them to be out. They're less likely to get picked off by lizards and birds, things like that. You usually get kind of a jagged leaf fallout or the leaf veins are still there. They're eating the soft tissue between them. Caterpillars and other pests love to hide under leaves or in cracks and crevices. Snails and slugs will do that too. Really good thing to do, check for frass. And frass is just a fancy word for poop. But if you see the poop near the damaged plant or on the damaged plant, you know you have an insect damage problem and maybe not a plant pathogen or plant disease problem. So very important to scout for that. Abiotic issues can mimic plant disease. Most of them are going to be symmetrical. So if you take that top leaf, I have a slide coming up next that explains a little bit more of this, and you fold it along that central middle leaf vein, it's roughly symmetrical on each side, right? The yellow parts and the green parts. It's almost like opening a book and closing a book with the same picture on both sides of the book. If you get into some modeling of the leaves and they're blotchy or irregular patterns, that's usually indicative of a virus. So these are both citrus leaves. The top one is an iron shortage and the bottom one is citrus greening disease. And you see how that bottom one, the yellowing, the green parts are very blotchy. If you were to fold that leaf in half, they're not symmetrical at all. That one up top is. That can be a really good diagnostic tool. It's important too to know what some of the plant nutrient deficiencies can look like. There's lots of charts out there online, even some AI inspired apps that can diagnose them for you. So this information is readily available. And you see some of those look an awful lot like plant disease. So it's important to know. All right, I know we're getting towards the end. Here's some of my top plant diseases, some of my favorites. And when I talk about scouting, using a hand lens, often these things are very cheap online. They fold up, you can keep them in your purse or in your car, to take a closer look at some of these plant diseases to help you diagnose them. Really encourage everyone to invest in one. My very favorite one lately has been citrus canker. This is a wind and rain driven bacterial disease of citrus. There's no cure. You can prevent it by planting resistant cultivars. So satsumas are somewhat resistant, calamondins, kumquats, and you can spray preventative systemic copper every 20 days. It's supposed to be 21 to 30 days there. The copper prevents the bacteria from landing on the leaf surface and infiltrating the stomata, which are the little holes in the leaf, and forming the cankers. So you can prevent it, but once it's there, there's no cure, but you can manage it again with that same copper every 21 days, which is, a little bit of work. Citrus greening is my number 2 favorite one. It's a disease caused by bacteria that's vectored by a psyllid insect. And I've got a picture of the insect there at the bottom. If you were in my talk a few weeks ago, you learned to recognize this guy. It's got a bacteria in its gut, and when it feeds on that citrus tree, it's putting the bacteria into the vascular tissue of the citrus tree. And it's basically like AIDS. It's an autoimmune disease in these trees. There's no cure. There's only management. Luckily, you can manage it nutritionally by making sure that you've got plenty of good, healthy roots to support that tree. Boron, micronutrients, manganese, things like that. Compost is really good to use, foliar sprays. But this some relatively new research that I'm still digging into, where we know we can't cure these trees, and it's really hard to prevent the psyllid from vectoring that bacteria into the trees. So how do we manage it? And we can do that, it turns out, through soil health. So that's something you can read about a little bit more if you're interested. Fig rust, we covered this a little bit, largely harmless, very common in late summer. They will drop a lot of these leaves and defoliate, but you'll see new fresh ones emerge, usually within a week or two. Rake these infected leaves up, don't compost them, it just spreads it again next year. And it's got little to no impact on yield. So it's not one that you really have to think about or really manage at all. Here's a good one. If anyone's driven around town lately, they've probably seen dead palms that look a lot like this. We have 2 different related diseases called lethal yellowing and phoenix palm decline. Really, really sad. It's vectored by an insect that they still haven't really identified, and it's impacting the palms. So that insect lands in the palms, it feeds on it, it vectors the phytoplasma into the tree, and then it declines over time and it dies slowly. You can actually treat it with an antibiotic, or not treat it, manage it. Sorry, I misspoke. You can slow that decline and death by injecting the trees with oxytetracycline, or if you have healthy palms, everyone knows how expensive they are. You can protect them by drilling and injecting that OTC on a schedule a couple times a year. And really help protect them from that bacterial infection spreading or even establishing enough to cause this death in the first place. If trees are declining or they look like this, they need to be removed. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of them in our area, and it's spreading very rapidly. Phytophthora root rot. Seeing this a lot this time of year as it's wet. We have very wet soil right now. Typically impacts a lot of fruit trees, shrubs, woody ornamentals. It's a water mold that kind of moves through the soil as it's wet. Good drainage is key. to preventing this from establishing. There is no cure. You can plant resistant plants and manage the soil water. So if you've got Phytophthora killing your azaleas or your citrus trees, improve the drainage in that area before you plant back into it, and maybe don't plant the same thing we had there before. There are some root drenches, although many of them have been pulled off of the market to manage these diseases in the soil profile. They're being reassessed by the EPA kind of on a rotating basis, and we can't get most of them anymore. The environmental damage is too great to justify saving the tree or the shrub or the ornamental. So good drainage is key if you're going to plant things that are woody. Maybe plant them in a high spot versus a low spot, or berm up or build a raised bed to try to manage it. Powdery and downy mildew is super common in a lot of our vegetable crops. Zinnias, I have it all over out my zinnias right now. You can clip these infected leaves out, promote good airflow through your garden. You can treat with copper, neem oil, sulfur. I've heard of folks using like sour milk even, change the leaf pH so that this downy mildew or powdery mildew can't get established. I really like to use a copper fungicide. It works great. There's organic Omri approved ones, and neem is pretty effective on it also. But you do want to prune these out, bag them, trash them, don't compost them because it'll just spread it. Sooty mold. This is one that pops up a lot this time of year. It's actually a secondary, not even a disease, a secondary condition that follows insect feeding. So any insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts might be feeding on your plants like aphids or whitefly or scale. They're going to be secreting or pooping out honeydew, so sugar water basically. And that sugar water grows this sooty mold or this black mold on the leaf surface or your car or whatever is beneath where those insects are feeding and secreting that honeydew. It does wash off with a little water and maybe a little soap added to it, but you need to kill or manage the insect pest to get the sooty mold to actually go away. So you can use insecticidal soap, maybe something a little higher octane, depending on what pest it is. If you kill that pest, the sooty mold will clear up. Entomosporum and Cercospora leaf spots, really prevalent this time of year. I mentioned it in crepe myrtle, beets, and chard also. You can manage it in your vegetable crops with copper, neem, or sulfur, good airflow, so don't really pack your rows together of beets and chard. Removal of the infected material promptly, so maybe clip those leaves off in the mornings when you notice them. But it's not really a huge issue. It doesn't cause a lot of decline if you stay on top of it. Entomosporium leaf spot shows up in Indian hawthorns. If anyone's got Indian hawthorns, maybe around their house or in your parking lot, they're going to have this leaf spot. That's a good picture of it down below. It does cause a lot of decline and can cause death in the Indian hawthorns. They used to be a really popular landscape ornamental. I no longer recommend planting them in the New Orleans area. With the Cercospora leaf spot and crepe myrtle, again, harmless, enjoy the fall color. It's not going to kill the tree. The next three are all tomato conditions, but they can impact other vegetable crops. Early blight. This is really one that shows up in the springtime, but it can show up anytime. The lower leaves are typically infected. The pathogens in the soil, it splashes up in the rain onto the lower leaves. I like to keep my tomatoes trimmed clean, 12 to 18 inches. So they've got a stalk or a stem with no leaves on it above the soil, 12 to 18 inches before I let them make a canopy. And I like to lay mulch down underneath them too. It can help prevent a lot of these blights. If you can prevent it, then you don't have to manage for it, right? Remove and clip off any infected leaves. That's what they look like. Remove any infected fruits. And I like to get my tomatoes on just a weekly copper, neem, or sulfur spray routine, especially in wet conditions. It can help prevent a lot of this from taking hold. Southern blight is another one in tomatoes. Rapid wilting and decline. That's a really great picture from one of the farms down there below, where a section of that tomato row is just wilting out. You pull it up, you see these sclerota, and they can produce those. They persist in the soil for 30 years. and there's no cure, only management there. So I might not plant tomatoes or anything susceptible in that row, or I might even just remove all that soil and replace it. It might come to that. That's something, there are some management techniques where you use a resistant bred tomato. You can actually shop for resistant varieties. I'll talk a little bit more about that if you're going to plant back into that area, but my advice is just don't. Late blight pops up anytime, but I see it a lot kind of late summer, early summer too. The leaf edges are damaged first. You get kind of a white kind of fuzz to the upper leaf surface. You can manage this with resistant tomato varieties, weekly copper, neem, or sulfur, and then just prune any infected material out. With these blights, good airflow is key. The more sun and air penetration you get to those leaf surfaces, the less of that fungus problem or that bacterial problem you're likely to get. You also get better coverage with whatever preventative spray you're using, and that can go a long way to keeping this kind of thing under control. Root rot nematodes, we talked about these guys. Huge issue in okra, root veggies, and tomatoes. I've seen it in carrots. It's really crazy. Crop rotation and planting resistant crops help a lot. These guys do not like brassicas, anything in that mustard, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, collard green, turnip family. So you can rotate that through an area. You can solarize the soil. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You can use predatory nematodes. So the predatory ones eat these root knot nematodes. You can cover crop with brassicas or French marigolds and till it under to try to manage it, but it is tough to get rid of once it's in an area. Armillaria and Ganoderma in trees, we talked about that too. Ridamil Gold is a pretty common product that's used to slow the rate of infection, but again, it's not a cure. If you have a tree with these symptoms, you might want to call in a consulting arborist to do a structural assessment, make sure the tree is not hollow, make sure it's still sturdy enough to survive storm season. And then maybe get it on some sort of a management schedule nutritionally, and maybe with some fungicide products, but it's not a cure. Dampening off, in your seedling trays, make sure you use a sterile seed starting mix, something light and fluffy that drains well, and really manage your moisture. Water from the bottom, try not to get those seedlings wet, and make sure you're not watering too frequently. Let them dry out between waterings. And then last but not least, lichens. It's not actually a disease. Lots of calls to my office about lichens. It's a problem on a lot of older plants. It can indicate fertility and soil challenges, declining canopy health. If the canopy is nice and full, these guys don't like to grow in those areas. They need sunlight. And it's actually a fungus and an algae living together in a mutualistic relationship where the algae is photosynthesizing, the fungus is processing food, and they're transferring things back and forth. And it can grow on anything. It can grow on a fence post or a car. But I see it a lot in older plants, and it usually means there's some other underlying health problem. So plant disease management, I'll touch briefly on this. I know we're getting close to 7:30. Again, you can't cure disease, you can only manage it through avoidance, eradication, exclusion, protection, resistance, and therapy. And I'll touch briefly on each of them. Avoidance means picking a good site where you avoid the pathogen, planting timing, so you're not planting when conditions are favoring disease if possible. Use of certified disease-free seeds and transplants, that's really important. Modifying your cultural practices, so maybe planting into a raised bed or a berm so that those pathogens can't take hold. Eradication, that means, like it sounds, we rotate our crops, we burn the infected material, we don't compost it, we destroy the host or the host plant, and we treat the soil. Complete eradication almost never happens. It's super rare. I've actually never heard of it happening. But you can eradicate enough of the inoculum so that you get a low persistence of disease in your garden or your landscape or your orchard by removing the source. Exclusion. So inspecting plant stock or maybe putting quarantine in place. We're actually in a quarantine zone for several citrus diseases, and eliminating insect vectors, either organically or inorganically. And this is where scouting becomes really important. Get out there and look at your plants on a regular basis and take action early rather than later. Protection, so excluding and protecting those trees or shrubs or plants from the pathogen through applying fungicides, bactericides, or nematicides, use of beneficial insects, nematodes to control the vectors of the disease, and elimination of those insect vectors. You can use physical barriers or chemical barriers or traps. And on the left there, those are tree defender bags. They keep the Asian citrus psyllid from landing on the citrus tree and infecting it. So that's a protective measure. Resistance, use of resistant varieties found through breeding and selection. Anyone who's cracked open a seed catalog, you'll find these little codes that are associated with different resistances that are bred or found in certain cultivars. So that can be a really handy tool. Proper care of the crop nutritionally through the soil, drainage, etc. Resistance is not immunity. So if you were to plant these tomatoes in an area where the improper care is taking place, that can actually negate the resistance. So something to think about. And therapy, this is a pretty new one. Use of chemicals or microbials to enhance plant health to overcome symptoms. So using good mycelium to boost the root health, maybe treating with micronutrients to enhance plant growth and health. It can suppress symptoms is what they're finding. This is kind of bleeding edge plant science here, where you can actually use horticultural therapy and management of nutrients to overcome some symptoms and suppress them. You don't cure the plant or the tree, but you can make it healthy enough to produce. I do like to think of all of these things as sort of my integrated pest management toolbox. That's IPM. My master gardeners will recognize that, where I'm not just reaching for a spray bottle every time. I'm physically removing diseased plant material, maybe clipping it out, pruning it out, pulling plants. I'm protecting my plants using resistant varieties, barriers, environmental or cultural changes. I'm out there all the time looking at stuff, so frequent scouting, catching the problem early. I'm using plant health support via nutrition and soil health, so I'm always making sure I have the best possible soil and growing conditions. And then I might reach for a fungicide, nematicide, or bactericide. So it's not my first move. I have this toolbox to choose from. And real quickly, a couple of Ag Center resources. We are here to help. It's a free public service, and my email address is at the end of these slides, so you guys can jot that down. We do have a plant diagnostics lab on campus where for 20 bucks in a form that you send in, Dr. Raj Singh will actually use PCR analysis to find out exactly what pathogen is impacting your plant, what best management tools we can use to kind of overcome it. There are instructions on the website on how to send samples in. It's best to overnight them Monday through Wednesday so they don't get stuck in the mail over a weekend when the lab is closed, because it is living material. Plant diseases are alive, many of them, so even viruses. So they do want them alive when they arrive. And you can visit their website to get instructions there, or you can reach out to me and I can walk you through it. And that's a $20 form. We have a lot of publications and fact sheets on our website too. It's lsuagcenter.com, or you can Google LSU Ag Center, whatever disease or plant you're interested in. These are free PDFs that you can print or download, and we have them for just about everything. You can also reach out, and I probably have it, and I can email it to you also. Oops. Management guides. We have residential and commercial spray guides and management guides. There might be a cost with the printed guides, but we have this hot link down here. If you Google management guides, LSU Ag Center, you get a giant disease management guide that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages sorted by crop that you can search and click through, and just about anything you could possibly grow in New Orleans or in Louisiana, you can find the management for diseases or insects or weeds for that particular crop on our website. And that's the link there, or you can find it, just Google LSU Ag Center management guides and it should come right up. It's in our store as well. If you want a printed physical copy, it's a really big publication. We also have the GNO Gardening magazine. It comes out monthly. This is free, and it's timely articles and advice on what me, Dr. Joe, and Chris are seeing each month when we're out and about on our routes. It's local advice, and you can sign up by sending an email to gnogardening@agcenter.lsu.edu. And you can also reach out to the local agents. Each parish has somebody assigned to it, and we can do free diagnostics of plant issues, including diseases. Usually via photo. We're pretty sharp on this now with lots of practice, or we'll set up a site visit to come out and take a look or send a lab sample in if needed. But these are all of our contacts here, and mine's down there at the bottom. And that's a free public service. And with that, here's my contact and the Ag Center's website, and we are right at 7:30. I did it. If anyone has any questions.
Anna, thank you so much. That was amazing. Y'all, if you have questions, you can unmute and ask them or put them in the chat. We're happy to answer anything that we're able to.
All right, I'm seeing a few in the chat. Let me scroll up real quick. Okay. A few of you noticed that your figs were looking bad. Occasional spray, she's mentioning, yes, there are OMRI, which is the organic approved products for managing blights and these things. That's something I'm happy to work with you to find the right product, especially if you're looking for that certified organic product. But there are copper and sulfur-based sprays that work on those that are OMRI approved. For Neiman sprays for tomatoes against blight, would it be foliar or into the soil? It would definitely be foliar. You want to get it so that it's almost creating a protective film on the leaf surface where the infection can take place. Other questions? Citrus greening, how often to apply fertilizer with micronutrients? Can you give a name for a good product? I don't have one yet. The best possible thing I'm hearing out of Florida is to fertilize using our regular fertilizer schedule. So we recommend roughly a pound of actual nitrogen per age of the tree. So if you have a 10-year-old tree, you put out 10 pounds of actual nitrogen in February, and then you do half that amount again in June. That helps tremendously. You can also use micronutrients, like just a basic cocktail of them. I know folks like kelp meal, they like Epsom salts. That's something I can work with you on. There are actual citrus fertilizers out there, but the best thing I've observed and what I'm hearing out of Florida is just very good, high quality compost is going to have a lot of what you need. So make sure if you're putting out your nitrogen on the right schedule, the right rate, also apply 3 to 4 inches of good finished compost to that drip line of the tree to give it all the microbes it needs, like zinc, boron, manganese, things like that. It should have more than enough for it. And that also stimulates plant health, right? Because we've got a lot of beneficial microbes and mycelium in that living compost. It's not a fertilizer. Compost is never a fertilizer, but it has a ton of other benefits. And that's all pretty new research coming out of Florida. How would we treat peach scale? That starts with after the peach drops all its leaves, when it goes dormant for the year, start treating with an all-season or horticultural oil. And we can actually send you the peach guide, or you can Google LSU Home Orchard and it will come up. And you do have to spray a couple times in the spring to overcome it. And then we do a copper fungicide once we get into the rainy season. So that's something you can find online as well. Is it safe for animals or humans to consume plants if they have disease? Yes. So the good news is these plant diseases are specific to their host in many cases. So they're specific to plants. They don't pose much threat to human cells or animal cells or tissues. None of them that I mentioned would kill you or make you sick. I'm glad somebody brought that up. And I see I got a few more messages. How do you do the copper Neiman sulfur treatment? There's no specific product, but if you go to any garden center, they're gonna have multiple options for you. A lot of the independent garden centers, if you walk in, tell them what you're trying to treat, or maybe bring a leaf sample in a plastic baggie. They can recommend what products they're carrying, and there are usually organic and conventional or synthetic products available. So there's something for everyone, with varying degrees of success, but you can definitely find these things at all the garden centers. Copper fungicide is a really common one. Especially during hot, rainy weather, it does protect against many things. And then horticultural or neem oil also helps an awful lot with plant disease protection. If you have any kind of tree or shrub that goes dormant for part of the year, it's good to hit it with that oil, or before it gets too hot and rainy. So like when we were back in June, right towards the tail end of June would have been a good spray time. But we do have general guidelines for spraying, organic or again, synthetic products, whichever you prefer. That's something we have info on our website, through the Get It Growing videos, or through GNO Gardening, the magazine. Or you can just shoot me an email and I can usually tell you. Other questions?